Good morning and welcome to Deacon Edge at Federation Square for this offering of the Archbishop's Conversations. We start by acknowledging the original custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, knowing that the work of reconciliation requires our ongoing commitment. My name is Elizabeth Murray. I am the Assistant Curate at St John's Anglican Church in Toorak, and I'm pleased to be your MC for today's conversation on the question, Loneliness, Australia's Next Health Crisis. Archbishop Freier is joined today by Helen Page and Patrick McGorry. Helen is Head of Community Care in the aged care area of the Brotherhood of St Laurence. She began her career as a registered nurse at the Alfred Hospital and then moved into aged care because she saw a need for more health professionals in this sector. She works with older Australians in residential care as well as the general community. A key interest for Helen is to address loneliness and isolation that can occur across demographics, particularly as people age. Please make Helen Page welcome. Pat McGorry was Australian of the Year in 2010. He is the Executive Director of Origin, Professor of Youth Mental Health at the University of Melbourne, and a Founding Director of the National Youth Mental Health Foundation, Headspace. Patrick is a world-leading researcher in the area of early psychosis and youth mental health, and has been directly involved in research and clinical care for homeless people, refugees, and asylum seekers. His work has played a critical role in the development of safe, effective treatments and innovative research into the needs of young people with emerging mental disorders, notably psychotic and severe mood disorders. He has played a major part in the transformational reform of mental health services to better serve the needs of young people with mental ill health. He is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Science. He is current President of the International Association of Youth Mental Health and past President of the Society for Mental Health Research and the Schizophrenia International Research Society. Please make Pat McGorry welcome. Today's conversation will be moderated by John Cleary. John is a former ABC presenter who worked extensively in both radio and television. As a result of his 30 years with the ABC, he is one of the best-known commentators on religion, including his work with Sunday Nights on ABC Local Radio, The Religion Report on ABC Radio National. John's career began in Perth. He was a member of the original Compass team and a co-presenter on the philosophy program Meridian in the 1990s. John hosted the interfaith event hosted by the Catholic Church in conjunction with World Youth Day, and he continues to be in high demand as a speaker and moderator, and it is our pleasure to welcome John back here today. Please make John welcome. The initial conversation between the Archbishop and his guests will go for about 45 minutes. We will then take questions from the audience, and we hope to finish promptly at 8:45 a.m.
Thank you and good morning. An Australian psychological journal last year suggested loneliness could be Australia's next public health crisis. Also last year, Britain's Conservative government took the unusual step of appointing a minister for loneliness. So, what's going on? Is this a sudden flare-up of a disease that's been lurking in our midst for many years? Is it a genuine crisis? Or simply another means for a few academics to milk more money from the public teat for questionable research? Well, Britain's decision came following the findings of a government commission to examine the issue. Their work indicated loneliness is far more common and potentially far more dangerous than publicly understood. It affects up to 1 in 3 individuals. It can damage your brain, your immune system, and can lead to depression and suicide. Loneliness can also increase your risk of dying prematurely as much as smoking can. and even more so than obesity. So, if there is such a crisis, how is the condition defined? Who is affected by it? What are the causes and what may be the remedies? Professor Patrick McGorry, is there an emerging crisis of loneliness? How serious is it? And how do you define the term? I mean, aren't some people merely happy with their solitude?
I think some people are happy with their solitude. There are certainly certain types of people that thrive on it in a way. I mean, we used to say that someone who is well suited to be a lighthouse keeper would be horrified to be in a marketing department, for example. So there are definitely niches for people that suit them. But I think the stats you just quoted show that the problem is real. It's getting worse. There does seem to be evidence showing that, however you measure it, it's probably a little bit difficult to measure it, actually. It does seem to be becoming much more of a problem in the last sort of maybe 20 years or so. Defining it, I mean, there are probably a few different definitions. Maybe Helen's got a few too, but the ones that I quite like were, there are three types of loneliness. One is intimate loneliness, which really involves whether you've got intimate relationships, and that might be anywhere between 1 and 5 people who you can really confide in at a deeper level. Then there's relational loneliness, which is a slightly wider circle of support. And then there's collective loneliness, which is a much wider sort of group membership of different, say, sporting organisations or clubs or things like that. And the basic definition of loneliness seems to be a perceived lack of, or a perceived social isolation. So if you perceive it to be like that, it's very much a subjective thing. And the final thing I'd say is that it's not the number of relationships so much, it's the quality of them that people really sort of go to when they're thinking of this idea.
The subjectivity of it is part of the problem in making it a public issue. That is it societal? Is it personal? Is it what? Helen Page, in your experience, from years of practice in the field, do you see evidence of such a crisis, and what for you are the presenting circumstances?
Well, I think that it's always been evident in the residential care setting that our clients are potentially lonely, and that's a reflection of the many losses that people have experienced before they find themselves in residential care. So there's a lot of reasons why they're already isolated. But I've also seen on the flip side where clients come into residential care and flourish because they're not alone at home anymore. So one of the things that does concern me is that we're very keen to keep people at home longer, and that's been a definite policy decision that's been driven. And most of us would like to think that we'd like to always stay at home, but we do see many clients who are potentially disadvantaged by that as well because of the loneliness. So.
Is it, you've worked particularly with aged care and see it presenting there, but the Brotherhood works across the field. Do you see it in other sectors? Can you sector it? Can you say, look, there are particular issues with aged care, there are particular issues with other cohorts?
Well, the Brotherhood works across many parts of our community that are vulnerable and potentially disadvantaged. So that might be culturally diverse people, asylum seekers, unemployed and youth, so and aged care. And I think within each of those groups of society there'd be different reasons why people would be vulnerable to feeling lonely.
There's been a particular focus in Australia over the last couple of years on suicide rates, particularly they're saying men and young people. There's concerns about, is this reflected with the loneliness thing as well? Is it?
Well, Patrick might be better to answer that one.
I think, the rising suicide toll is a national crisis. It really is. 3,000 people plus every year. I was listening to the radio this morning and they're talking about the veterans. 30 veterans at least a year. So there are subgroups of high risk. Young people, it's getting worse. Despite the fact that we have started to build a system of care for young people. You mentioned headspace. Well, that's like a thin green line, but we're seeing very large numbers of young people coming in with much more complex problems than can be dealt with in a primary care system. They need much more specialised and also more sustained care, and it has to be of the quality. Coming back to this topic today, you have to feel a real human connection with the person or the people that are trying to help you, and the system is almost. It's become, especially the state system, it's really imploded. That's why we've got a Royal Commission in Victoria. The state system is not capable of providing that humane care, despite the best efforts of the people working in it. There's many amazing people trying to make a completely broken system work, but it's that human connection, that kind of sustained human connection has gone missing, basically, which is the essence of psychiatry and the essence of mental health care. And so I think that's one of the big reasons. There are lots of social factors driving suicide, social and economic factors, but the final pathway is despair, hopelessness and despair. If you cannot actually provide the life-saving care to the people at that point, then they die. They die in big numbers. Hundreds of the people that die every year have already tried to get help from the system, and they fail.
We're turning human beings into clients and customers that are one step removed from personal interaction.
Yeah, well, also the system, because it's so beleaguered, it's trying to avoid helping people most of the time. It's trying to work out why they can't provide care. That's what triage systems do. Like on a battlefield, they're trying to get rid of the people that they've given up on, sort of thing. That's what's happening in our public mental health system every day. These poor people seeking help, and also poor people trying to provide it, but with a Sophie's choice. Who do I reject?
Archbishop Philip Freier, from your perspective as a leader of one of the major social institutions, are you concerned that there is, in fact, a wider dimension here, that it's not simply a clinical issue, that may have something to do with the nature of our society, a shift in the nature of our social relationships, the way we're dealing with our society? Like, over the past couple of generations, we seem to have moved into a world of unprecedented individualism, consumerism, the promise of boundless happiness with the next fashion purchase or the next course in personal empowerment. Yet, at the same time, we're experiencing an increasingly lonely world of unravelling communities and families. Is this, for example, the apotheosis of there's no such thing as society?
Yeah, John, I think most of us could probably do the mental experiment of how we, in a way, because I think we're small, we're finite, we're mortal, but there's a different sense of what that feels like when you're in the immensity of nature on your own to when you're in, say, an immensely busy city or in a subway train in New York or a tube in London or even a crowded tram or a train here in Melbourne. There's something, in a way, if we're alone in nature, we are kind of open to things. Our senses are open, and it sometimes is a wonderfully transforming and rich experience within us to have a sense of our smallness compared to something great. And Christians, of course, would understand that to be the greatness of creation, the transcendence of God, finding a right place there. But I think there's something about the shut down character of often our life in society, because when if you're on a tube in London, say, you avoid eye contact. It seems to be one of the great rules. I sometimes break and actually talk to people, and I find people talk back to me, which is shocking for the other people on these transport things. They actually will have a conversation, but we get into this kind of shut down place, and I'm not a neural scientist, but I think that probably does something to the way we're wired. We end up intentionally being in that very tense situation of shutting down, not interacting, and probably there's a whole lot of anxiety that can build up in that place because you don't know what other people are doing. So there's something about us living the way we live, I think, that is very different to perhaps experiences some of us have had, or even how a generation or two before us lived.
Well, let me just continue that a little further, and I'll get each of us to comment on that. many social scientists talk these days about the fact that in the last 2 generations we've gone through more, in the West particularly, we've gone through more transformation in our social structures than we have for the past 3,000 years. That is, we're actually deconstructing family. The focus on individualism has actually began to change the way the fabric works, and that wider social issue is something we are simply have ignored the consequences of completely. Patrick McGorry.
Yeah, well, I think, I can remember my father's family and how many, it was a large family, lots of cousins, and traditional families had that much more, deeper and closer relationships, and now we've got these nuclear families that are dislocated from, geographically or in many ways from their roots and their traditions, One of the things that helps you, I work with young people, so young people growing up need what we call scaffolding around them to help them grow up, and if you don't have it, if you're a child in out-of-home care or if your family disintegrates when you're growing up, or the scaffolding around children and young people growing up is much more fragile than it used to be under pressure. Other things in the scaffolding would be the educational system, the pathway to a secure vocation. That was much more straightforward, say 30 or 40 years ago than it is now. You've got the gig economy and tremendous insecurity for young people. On the other hand, the flip side is they've got a lot more freedom. So the choices and the freedom is much greater, you could say. So maybe it's better, but the price of freedom is more mental ill health. That's what we see.
A surfeit of choice.
Yeah, it's like, people use terms like affluenza and these sort of terms, but that's sort of in the zone of what I'm talking about. The society has become much more complex and insecure, and also the values of the society seem to be degenerating. People feel that, in the political leaders and the collapse of various institutions, or lack of trust in institutions. So it's a much more, unstable and insecure world, isn't it? And the family and the traditional family structures and the cultures. I was born in Ireland, so when I go back to Ireland, I still see a lot of, of that traditional sort of depth in that culture, which countries like Australia don't really have. They have it in the multicultural sort of world, but they don't have it. It's sort of got lost a bit, I reckon.
Helen, are there particular ways in which things that you'd nominate as being elements in the people you see?
I think that for older people, the adoption of technology, or the rapid improvements in technology, have been a double-edged sword. So for some people who are adopters of technology, it has allowed them to connect with each other and with family. And when you think of what's possible with Skype, and many people have family living all over the world, so it allows them to keep connected. But for many older people who haven't adopted technology and perhaps can't even use a mobile phone, it can be quite isolating. And the way we've adopted it throughout our society, we've replaced a lot of person-to-person interaction with technological interaction. So people would have been accustomed to going into the bank and withdrawing money. Now,
and have a conversation.
And have a conversation, and probably know a bit about the teller that they are served by. And now I see tellers taking older people out to the ATM and trying to show them how to use the ATM. And many banks just don't have branches now. So, the interactions that people would have once had in their veggie shop and with the local butcher don't really happen now in a big impersonal supermarket, and even going to pay bills at the post office. There's a lot of opportunities that older people don't have now that they would have.
Yeah, Archbishop, the way in which even things like work are approached are profoundly changing. I mean, we've moved from the assembly line to the workstation, so people aren't working in groups as much as they did anymore. That sense of natural community.
I think we're picking up issues that are part of a very long tradition of critiquing the human condition and society. I mean, if you go through the long biblical tradition, there is the condemnation of idolatry, which is putting false things in the place of God. But alongside of that is also the emphasis on right relationships between people. And I think you see that in more modern French post-structuralist thinking of ideas of simulacrums, things which are represented but aren't the real thing. So I kind of think, we have a lot of things which in themselves are not bad, but if the outlet to our emotion, our empathy, is only really a digital image on a screen rather than real people, we're kind of using really good stuff within us, which makes us human, in a shallow and a vacuous way. So I think that whether it's at work, whether it's in our entertainments, whether it's just in our daily living, where we've got a long tradition which critiques what we're like, but we're a bit, gone down that way and not really reflecting with the right tools at the moment.
The two-edged sword of technology that you mentioned. I had this extraordinary experience the other day. I'm sure you've all had this experience of stepping onto a hugely crowded suburban train. You sort of think, oh, I get in. Oh, at last, I get in. And you're greeted by the sounds of silence.
Yeah.
Because everybody there is just staring and just doing this.
With their earphones in.
And the world stops, rather than, if you go back 30 years ago, you'd get on that crowded train and you'd be talking furiously to people.
There's a slide of there's an American researcher. She came out to Australia last year, and she had a picture of a young person's party in 1970 with, drugs, rock and roll, sex, everything in the picture, and a picture of a current sort of party where they're all at the party looking at their mobile phones.
And we make jokes about it, but we are saying that actually, really, there is something quite profound going on here.
And in fact, the fact that we're facing an ageing population, there's been a lot of work and a lot of investment in research into technology to support older people in aged care, people in their homes. And in fact, there's a tool, I suppose you'd call it, that's been doing the rounds of aged care services for a while as part of their lifestyle programs, and it's a robotic seal. I don't know if any of you've seen it. I think it's called Paro. And that speaks volumes to me, that a solution to support older people that are needing to connect is to provide a robotic animal. And it's actually quite engaging, and it gets quite good results, but, I probably prefer a puppy myself, but it's indicative of what's happening. Yeah.
Well, let's just keep on this social media thing for a moment. I mean, you could go back perhaps to, say, 1956 with the arrival of television to mark the first moment when people began to say, hang on, something's changing here. The mum, dad and the teacher and the local minister were replaced by the box in the corner, and kids all of a sudden could get a world that was outside their immediate social world. The last 10 years, with the explosion of social media, have, in the minds of many, taken that to a whole new stage, that there are, that it's not just Facebook, it's kids' access to pornography. I mean, there is a quite significant shift going on that social media is facilitating, and people are now saying, look, there may be some goods here, but there really are some quite profound, directly identifiable bad things in it. We talk about bullying and other things. Archbishop.
Yeah, I think these things are just ubiquitous, and I observe. I was at an event on the weekend, and there was a choir singing, and this is a choir of people who were Karen people from Myanmar. But there was a very tiny little boy at the back, standing behind his mother, and he had a mobile phone, and he was occupying himself while this choir was singing, intently looking at whatever he was doing on the screen. So I think, it's ubiquitous. It's being so adopted early in people's lives. I imagine, again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but that probably has an effect on perception, just the wiring, how our neural pathways are laid down, which and I think there's always been this kind of feeling we are seeing a generation rising unlike anything we've ever seen before. That's actually a repeated cadence throughout human history, but we are seeing probably people who are developing now who will be very different from those of us who, in a way, in an adult and in our adult life. And I reflect back for significant parts of my young adult life. I was living in remote Aboriginal communities in Australia, where if we went out camping in the bush, we had no contact with anything. We just had stories to tell. We had the wide sky. We had the sounds of the bush on the bank of a creek, and but it was very rich. You didn't feel missing something. It was wonderfully rich because it was rich with both human interaction, connectedness to place, and a connectedness across time of people telling stories of something. And so I wonder, whether that kind of inside of us, I'd call it spiritual, but inside our souls, our human experience can be as rich and how it would be in the digital space.
That issue of connectedness, I'd like to come back to in a moment, but Patrick McGorry, this question that's raised by social media analysts and the point that the Archbishop has raised, that there may be some connection between the amount of time young people spend with devices and the development of their own neural pathways. Is that just hype, or is there something to be said about that that is real?
Well, I think the brain is pretty plastic, so people learn and get into habits, and there's also an addictive element to social media, isn't there? So definitely that there's a neural basis for everything, really, isn't there? That's true, but just you mentioned the word connections, and the Archbishop was talking about that too, connections to nature. A lot of the really deeply wired things that we have are things that we're talking about, connections to others, attachments, like emotional attachments to other people, attachment to the work, to the environment, to the land, to the, where you feel home, where you feel at home, those sort of deeper sort of things. And at the same time, you could say that social media is increasing attachments, like when I talked about the different levels of definitions of loneliness, the collective loneliness is probably improved by social media because you're connected to a whole wide, it could be millions, that you're connected to potentially. So, but it's a kind of a more superficial connection, and it's a different quality. And the thing that might be going missing here is authentic, intimate connections, because
connections that challenge you, as much as feed you.
So I don't know. If that's really been properly analysed or researched, but the person whose slides I mentioned earlier, the American researcher, she definitely thinks that the mental health of young people, and she's got some US data to really back this up, has got worse since the iPhone appeared. Like it's a bit like colour TV caused cancer, but you can't prove it. But there's definitely an association between the worsening mental health of young people and the advent of the iPhone. So something has happened to the last generation of young people to cause a deterioration in their mental health in ways that we see every day in Headspace.
Let me shift it slightly and go to the way in which the community is responding, or the way in which the resources that are available in the community and general attitudes towards mental health. Some people would say, look, there's been a problem with mental health generally for years, and you could trace it back, and this is linked to the loneliness thing directly, to the way in which, from the 70s onward, there's this fashion of deinstitutionalisation, of get people out of those big places where they were to get, well, it was almost described as though sort of locked up in these sort of mass incarceration. Is there an issue there with the way that governments have approached the issue of mental health and well-being that can be traced back to that phase?
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, in the 19th century, the mentally ill were, it was a well-intentioned movement to sort of build the asylums, because otherwise they were going to be homeless or chained up in the back bedroom or even killed, you know. And that is still happening in developing countries, in low-resource countries. The seriously mentally ill, where there are no facilities, are just either killed, chained up in the backyard, or completely destitute and die, you know. So it's a huge human rights issue in those countries. So that was a good thing in the 19th century. Obviously, it became terrible, you know, in the 20th century, that they became, you know, I trained in those hospitals. I was very pleased to see the back of them, because they were, you know, very, very damaging institutions by the end of it, you know. But the government, the Kennett government here, governments all around the world, got rid of them and promised to replace them with well-funded, humane, biopsychosocial, you know, community mental health services. And they started off on the right foot, but then they completely lost the plot, state governments in Australia. And now we have a national scandal where only a fraction of the people with serious mental illness get access to care. The care is very poor quality. It's provided under desperate circumstances. It's not very therapeutic anymore compared to even 20 years ago. And that the workforces are just completely exhausted and demoralised. And so that is the situation of mainstream mental health care in this state. And that's why we have a Royal Commission. We've got a Premier who's honest enough to admit that, first person in the world to actually admit that this has failed. And the Royal Commission, I hope, will redesign it with the voices of the mentally ill and their families, you know, very strongly represented. So that's the situation. On the other hand, in Australia, we have a federal government too, which has been trying to invest in mental health care from the primary level up. And they've made a few pieces of progress with that, with better access and with headspace and things like that. But there's a huge bunch of people, hundreds of thousands of Australians in the middle between the emergency department and the GP, who have nowhere to go, you know. And they are dying, their lives are being blighted, and their loneliness is one aspect of it, but there's a whole range of other problems. They die 15 to 20 years earlier than the general population, much worse than Indigenous health. So this is the reality, and I don't think the public realise that. When they see Beyond Blue and they see awareness campaigns and they think, wow, isn't mental health going great? It's not.
Helen, the Brotherhood have been involved in this area alongside its service provision, involved in the identification of these issues for many, many years. It's the history of the Brotherhood. Do you track a similar path to what Patrick is outlining there with the way services have gone over the last...
Well, what we see is in our aged care area that we are seeing people who have survived all of that, fairly damaged and very vulnerable. And we seek to replace a lot of the losses that they've experienced. So for many people, you'd be familiar with the fact that people lose their friends, family and supports through the progression of an illness that's not well managed. And many of our clients have had institutional childhoods, so they've started off on the back foot. So we seek to really replace that by providing a safe community and meaningful connection and unconditional acceptance.
Are there programs being developed which have at their heart a realisation that things like loneliness are key, that connectedness and social relationships are the things that really make the difference, and that you can structure programs to deal with that?
Yeah. So, we've been talking in the aged care area for a number of years now about person-centred care, and that's about honouring the essence of the person and not just providing food and lodging, but to really support their aspirations and needs and desires and interests and give a really good quality of life. So that's certainly something that the Brotherhood's about across all of our programs.
It's very difficult to do, and Patrick, the Archbishop, Philip, I'll get you to reflect on this too. We've had a society which has been focused for so many years and still is on the me, that we seem to have lost the we in our approach to things, that there is a necessary we to everything, that we do in a society. And there is a particular role that, say, religious institutions have played in this over the years, the essence of it being religare, to bind together.
Well, I think that still continues. We'd have, I'm probably pulling a bit of a number out there, but about 200 parishes plus in the Greater Melbourne area. They probably have about 400, 500 congregations. And you extend that out into even, quite rural parts of Australia. And I know for the people who are part of those, these are quite enriching and life-giving parts of their identity. And where they work best, they're multi-age, and so people are probably experiencing richer interactions than they might just in their own domestic situation, where they could be alone or they could just be in one generation. So I think, yes, there's the loss of... We've almost lost a lot of small-scale things in our society. Everything tracks, whether intended or not, to more industrial scale. Nursing homes get bigger, the hospitals get bigger, everything gets more industrial scale, and I think we're really in great danger of losing the local.
But at the local level, people tend not to want that. People say, I want my individual freedom, I want my capacity to maximise my choices. So you've got a tension here which is almost a social tension which is not easily reconcilable.
Well, I think that's the dilemma, isn't it? I mean, that's the dilemma of being human. In a sense, there are the things that we are attracted to, but we know some of the things we're attracted to are sterile, they're addictive, they're not good for us, and this is the complex choice of really being a human in society and what our society is like. And I think discussions like this, discussions that might happen more seriously amongst those who set policy and look at mechanisms of delivery and what it means to actually have a priority on the local, a priority on early intervention, a priority of a whole lot of things that people probably know are good, but they tend to get lost in the industrial kind of scale of delivery of things.
Well, they want a tax cut.
But I think
does it boil down to that? There's some element of that, because I think
when you're looking at, say, health systems, I mean, everyone knows the value of early intervention. But it's very hard for early intervention to get priority of funding compared with acute care contexts. And I suspect that happens in mental health as much as it does in other areas of health.
Well, I think what I say about that is that when we look at heart disease and cancer, there's this concept of non-communicable disease. It's the main health problem in developed countries, non-communicable diseases. And the top 5 are cancer, heart disease, mental illness, diabetes, respiratory, those sorts of illnesses. If you look at, let's say, cardiac disease and also cancer, where you've seen great improvements in survival and reductions in mortality and better quality of life, actually, for people. Why has that happened? It's because you don't have these false dichotomies between treatment or palliative care and early intervention, early diagnosis and prevention. Cancer and heart disease do all of those things. They've been very successful in prevention up to a point. Obviously, it doesn't prevent everybody. So then you've got to have the early diagnosis. You stick a stent in if you've got a bit of chest pain before you have the heart attack. You remove the small breast lump before it spreads into the bones. You do very sensible, logical things. You also have late-stage care. If you present late, you have late-stage care, and you have palliative care to help people with the final phase of their lives. All of those things, you could say they're not all perfect, but they're all valued and supported. In mental illness, the only thing that's really valued is palliative care, because that's the only thing that's actually funded. Early intervention, which I spent my career trying to develop, we've got great evidence for it from our research studies and from our example programs like EPIC and headspace and these sort of things, but they're not scaled up usually, So the average person, we've had evidence about the early intervention for schizophrenia and psychosis for 25 years, and it's gone around the world in hundreds of programs, but the vast majority of people who develop at the onset of a psychotic illness, we've seen some on Four Corners the other night. I mean, these people are floridly unwell and they're still not getting treatment, let alone the subtle early signs. But we know if we pick up these illnesses in the very early stages, we can change the course of these illnesses. But mental health is the exception to the principles that you see in healthcare everywhere else. And the reason is it's funded about a third the level of what it needs to be funded, 1/3 in Australia. So it's 15% of the burden of disease nearly, and it's funded about 5 or 6% of the health budget. So when you do that, you're going to see disasters every day.
Coming to terms with that and developing a holistic program does require extensive clinical restructuring or restructuring of government delivery of services and other things, but that requires some change in social attitudes. And at the moment, over the last 20 years, society has moved far more towards the individual rather than the group.
That's all true. But there have been better attitudes towards the mentally ill, but it hasn't translated into funding.
Right.
So you've had Jeff Kennett and others saying, we've got to have more awareness, but they don't say you've got to actually then fund the services to provide, So that's the kind of disconnect that we've seen. But I know you want to talk about the individual versus the collective, and I actually do think that is a big change that's happened in society around the world since we had this domination of capitalism, actually. So we had in the late 1980s, we had the collapse of the counterweight of socialism, and whether you're a socialist or not, that counterweight had a restraining effect on the capitalist society. And I think what we've seen is, even social democratic regimes like in Scandinavia and Western Europe, which were very strong at that time, and really the sort of ideal societies that we all would like to be like more. Australia was more like that in those days too. But we've had this shift now to really just pure individualism, pure chasing the dollar. And I think personally, it's just only my personal opinion, that lack of a balance in philosophy of what society should be like is a really fundamental problem. Now, everyone's got their own opinion about that, so I just shared mine, that's all.
Well, I mean, even the churches, Archbishop, are not free from that. I mean, you could go to any one of a number of different churches around cities like Melbourne and Sydney and find people who will sort of talk about Jesus as your personal life coach. It's about the me rather than the we, or that, if one contributes to, if one commits oneself to the cause of faith, it's not the way of the cross, but the way of personal fulfilment. You'll put your money in the plate and the blessings will flow.
Society and its institutions are always going to be heavily intermingled. But it's where, does the wisdom just arrive out of where we land in society, or does it arise from us looking at some of our longer traditions, our evidence-based? There's a whole range of things which are fairly attested in human history as more useful than just guiding where we are, than just how you tend to land. And I think when we see an issue, if we think there's a problem, I think we should go and look at all of the traditions of wisdom, of evidence-based practice, and I think there are many things that come out of certainly of a Christian faith which critique society, and there are some beautiful traditions which actually value solitude as a rich experience rather than a despairing.
But it's solitude that takes place within a given context that the individual owns.
It's a social construction of that experience, and I think that's what we're in different language saying, that we are struggling to have the social construction of the individual in our society for everyone. Probably for some it's very rich, but for some people, despite everything that's around them and the many good things that are around them, they still experience this. The social construction of their reality is very barren and very empty and leads them to despair. So I think there's, it's not just, a lot of this is inside the person and in the authenticity, I believe, of relationships, of who we are and how those relationships are expressed.
We're talking about something quite complex here, and I want to address in a moment the things we can do as a society to perhaps ameliorate what we're talking about. But just getting to the heart of this question of what are the critical elements personally for a person feeling whole. Helen, in your experience, this constructing of communities of wholeness, or what are the key elements in giving people that sense of wholeness that extends not just to the now but over time?
It's two things from my perspective. One is to feel connected in some way, and that might be to a person or people, or even an establishment or a church, but to feel connected gives us meaning. And I guess the other kind of slant on that is a sense of belonging. So in my experience, people who don't feel as though they belong or feel that they have a meaningful place, that they then feel isolated and alone. And I think that that's a really important thing for us as a society to do. And I think that there's an increasing awareness of how important this is, and it's not just in the mental health area, but loneliness has been linked to cardiovascular disease and stroke and other illnesses. So there's an increasing awareness, and I see a lot of really fabulous things emerging to address it on a much more micro level than we've probably been discussing.
Well, give us an example of some of the things that cause you some optimism.
Yeah, so I've been talking a bit with people at U3A, the University of the Third Age, and they've got incredible enthusiasm and vitality, and are generally retired and have time. So they've been doing a lot of work on creating connections and, in fact, training connectors that support people to connect with different groups and interests and people within their community. And they've actually been successful in getting some government funding to support that. So that's pretty exciting to see. There's a group called Neighbourhood Connections, and they help people to create a micro community in their street. So they provide advice and a bunch of resources so that I might invite my street or my apartment block to share a meal or do something in the park together. Men's sheds are a really good example of this, and they've had great success. And that's a good example, I suppose, of a part of our community that's vulnerable to being lonely. Generally, retired men that perhaps socialise more comfortably when they're doing things, and it's not always about the blokey stuff. It's often other stuff that happens in men's sheds that's intellectual or highly technical that connects people.
What about, and Patrick, I might get you to comment on this, what about young people? I mean, young people tend to want to get away from family, exercise the muscles of adolescence and young adulthood, and yet at the same time they're considered some of the most vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that's less so actually these days. I can just speak about my own sons. They're a bit variable actually. My youngest son pretty much left home about 15 or 16 because he was extremely independent and just he was very different from the other two boys. But the other two boys didn't leave till about 26, so they were quite happy to be there. And we see them like several times a week. They live in Melbourne, and it's different. They didn't feel they needed to get away from us, and that's what I see in the young people. That the vast majority of young people are very comfortable with their parents actually these days. Compared to the 1960s or 70s, I would say, thinking about it.
I think there's a lot of parents that wish they would leave.
Yeah, that's right. The parents have to leave, actually. Quite right. So I think, obviously, that is the task of adolescence, to develop your own identity independent of your family of origin, but it's a much more, in some ways, a more protracted sort of process than it used to be. So, but I think identity is another thing that just listening to Helen speak about. Connection is one thing, but identity, and that's one of the things that's driving this sort of individualism and in the world. If you look at nationalist politics in Europe, for example, and even within the US and even in Australia in the last election, you see these sort of groups that feel somehow alienated from the rest of society, and they've got to assert their kind of identity. That's about where do I belong? I don't really belong to this, this there isn't like a unified sense of being an Australian anymore. In some ways, there's these alienated groups who are, at odds with other groups. Whether you're from North Queensland, you think about us down here in Melbourne as Chardonnay sipping, intellectuals or something, and then up there, they're the real people, and then we think about them in a negative way. After the election, there was the Quexit thing. So like these sorts of identity things are affecting society, I think, and maybe it's not right on the point, but it seems to be a trend. Yeah.
The churches historically see themselves as having a role here. The church provides the cradle-to-grave sense of meaning for people. There is order to this universe. Now, it can be expressed different ways in different religious communities. And I shouldn't just have said church, but I should say religion generally. And yet, in the West, religion seems to be failing. It's slipping away as a sense of order and meaning, of coherence.
And I think that's true, and I think it has. There is a readjustment from it being something which largely is heavily embedded in society, and to be a member of the society, a shared value of the society you might embrace, to becoming more, in a way, privatised and a matter of personal choice, neither of which are probably at the best point for where it makes a contribution, because I think that Christianity it does have as much to say about a personal relationship with God as it does about relationships with others and the kind of society we have. So I think we're in a transition point, but I don't think this slice in time is the last word on where we will sit.
Which is probably a good place to pause the conversation and allow our very patient audience to get involved.
So it is time for questions from the audience. Please it's our practice here to take 2 or 3 questions at a time. Please keep your questions brief so that we can hear the answers from our experienced panel here. There's a couple of roving microphones. Please raise your hand and I will attempt to see you. It's not as light as it usually is. I can't see you and I apologise if I miss you this time. There's down here to the front and then there's someone right up the back we'll start with. Thank you.
I had an interesting conversation with my 15-year-old last night who was objecting to the idea of an epidemic of loneliness, because an epidemic is about infectious diseases, was his point. But that got us talking about whether loneliness is infectious. And I was particularly thinking of the residential aged care, of what is it about a residential aged care where the loneliness doesn't kind of infect individuals one to another, but provides a place of healing instead.
I guess that one's for me, is it,
Question
Michelle?
And the question at the back.
Yeah, hello, my name is Adam Fuss. I live in St Kilda. I know some of my neighbours, like my neighbour Sheila, she's a veteran of the Second War. She sometimes knocks on my door, gives me slices of cake, we exchange birthday cards. And the City of Port Phillip, which covers areas like St Kilda, South Melbourne, Port Melbourne, Middle Park, Port Melbourne, they encourage neighbourhood parties. So we sometimes block up the street and we have barbecues and the children play cricket. So I know some of my neighbours like Bruce, Sheila, Ollie and Phil give me home. So I've got to connect this. I know some of my neighbours.
Was there a question or that was an observation? I will link them together. Is loneliness in fact infectious? Can we make each other lonely, and is perhaps a way of affecting that more local connection? Helen, to start with, given the aged care context.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't think that loneliness is infectious, and I'm thinking of the residential care setting. What I see in residential services is a bit like what I see in the community, and I'm an optimist, that our clients will tend to try and connect with other people in residential care that are showing signs of being lonely or isolated. And sometimes that's actually particularly challenging for them because there's always different personality types, and some people like to be on the edge and periphery of the activities that are going on. I think it's more the opposite. I think that where you've got a group of people and there's visible or tangible loneliness, I feel like other people try and improve that situation. And it was a delightful description of this chap up the back's community where they exchange birthday cards and know each other's names, and it's lovely to hear that there's people who do still feel connected with their community, because we've had this gentrification of communities that I think's made that much more difficult. Yeah.
I sort of wonder, John, whether there is, I compare like different crowds we're in. If you're like in a football crowd or something, you kind of feel a sense of solidarity. Your spirits feel lifted because, especially if you won, everyone's walking, they feel a connection. They don't know each other, but they feel connected. There's something of the filters that are down, and there is a potential personal warmth and connection with people
I'm
you
a
don't
Carlton
know.
supporter. I don't get any of that.
There's solidarity and suffering too, but you compare that to, say, your group on a train or in a lift or in an elevator in a crowded other place where you don't have that kind of permission. It's a bit as if it is infectious. There's something which flips the switch somewhere and says, look, it's okay to feel to be connected and in a way to feel good about it. And then there's other contexts where it seems we really pick up. The signal is, don't connect, eyes down, don't look at each, even though I'm sitting this far from Patrick, I should not engage with him. You're in their personal space, but you're not in their relational space. And I think there's something that does mess with our heads, because we know what we prefer. We know which feels better.
There's one down the front and so we'll start at the back because the microphone's got there first. Thank you.
Good morning. We've spoken a lot about young people, and we've also spoken about aged care. And Helen, I'm interested in your perspective, not on the people in your care, but the people working in that system. We spend a lot of our lives interacting with large organisations, and I'm interested in each of the panel's perspectives in the role of the organisation in what can they tangibly do to create connectedness or create a sense of belonging throughout our working lives, rather than at the start and at the end.
And thank you.
I was wondering if the panel could talk about people who are not lonely. There's a bit of a fine line there. A lot of people seem to just, look, it's human nature, or the nature of any animal species is to fit in. And if you don't fit in, you become ostracised. A lot of people seem to be able to fit in either through just simply being concurrent, compliant, agreeable. They won't rock the boat. At the other end of the scale, you've got people who are not lonely but work at it desperately to be not lonely, and you've got people who their narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy all comes out. So a lot of politicians, for example. Well, you've got the ABC last week who are trying to make journalists a bunch of ratbags, because, and that's probably a more broader scale which happens at a more intimate scale in society. If you don't fit in, you become ostracised. Or if you're slightly different, you're not one of us. If you're intelligent and you're mixing with a bunch of people who are not so intelligent, they'll get rid of you. I was just wondering if you can talk about people who are perhaps those sort of issues, and people who are not so lonely, and how they come about it.
Thank you for both of those. So the first one is, what can the places that we connect with for most of our working lives do to help us connect and feel a sense of belonging? And what about those who still experience isolation but aren't necessarily lonely? How do we learn from those connections, and what do they mean for us in the overall question?
Well, I think they're both really important questions. The first one is attracting a lot of attention, actually. The World Economic Forum has got a mental health program for the first time, and it's quite a big thing. We have a contract with them around youth mental health, but another big area that they're focusing on is workplace mental health. Companies are starting to realise that 20% of their workers are not well from a mental health point of view at any given time, and they're not actually getting good value out of those workers. That's probably one of the drivers, but there probably is some concern for their workers as well. So rather than just the usual tick-the-box employee assistance programs, they're starting to really think about what would a healthy workplace be like, and so this has got to do with, I suppose, connections at work and even the design of the workplace and all sorts of stuff like that, and empowerment, I suppose, those sorts of issues. So that's a huge area, so it's good that that's come up. The other issue is a really important one, and if you think about it from a mental health or psychiatric point of view, there are different personality types, I mean, you could label people, as narcissistic or, antisocial or whatever you want to do. But people have traits. They have, it's like a paint box. You have, a different sort of kaleidoscope of colours in a different person. So you might might not reduce someone to say you've got that personality or another personality, but you can see that people are different. And therefore different environments. We've talked a lot about the social world today, the wider society, but it's the fit of the person with the society that's the thing. Like with my analogy of the lighthouse keeper, someone who's very comfortable being alone, and doesn't mind, and actually thrives on that, is well suited to being a lighthouse keeper where you don't mix with many people. And that person might be very uncomfortable working in a busy office, when they're forced to interact. And people with mental illness, often get to be like that. They have social anxiety, and as a consequence of having the illness, and particularly with long-term schizophrenia, people are uncomfortable quite often with other people. But they could work if you found the right niche for them, So it's very important to think about it that way. And then you've got, as you said, power-seeking, narcissistic people who tend to be, hope there are no CEOs in the audience, but CEOs of major organisations, and or not that they're all like that, but that's a sort of a personality type that suits that sort of role, if I can put it that way. I am one of those, so I better be careful here. But then you've got politicians who probably, they're variable as well, but there would be a certain personality type that would be fitting in there, and then there'd be librarians, and then there'd be, elite sports people, and so personality is important to understand what kind of person you're dealing with. And of course, at another level, every human being is a unique individual too. So there are types, but there's variation within the types too. So
can I say in this context, pity the poor bureaucrat, because you seem to be saying that we've got all these complex problems which feed in on this.
Yeah.
Yet at the top, the bureaucrat is forced to face competing budget constraints, but at the same time there seems to be a lack of a coherent overview about what it is we're looking to deal with here, whether it's clinical service to the individuals or a way of our whole mental health strategy being an integrated whole rather than bits and pieces.
Yeah, well, politicians often just throw a few shekels at different aspects of the sector to keep them happy, and stop them complaining. Rather than having a narrative about what they want to do. I mean, successful politicians, I think, actually say, right, I'm in for 3 years or I'm in for 4 years. These are the 3 things I'm going to change and do in that time, rather than just giving everybody 50 cents and just keeping the status quo ticking over. There's got to be a narrative, which...
Is there a narrative available that has been recommended to government in this?
Yeah, this Royal Commission will show what the narrative actually is. There will be a narrative, and it will be a lot to do with some of the things that you haven't talked about solutions yet, but within mental health, the idea of peer support, we found that very helpful amongst young people, and it's becoming a thing within mental health care. It doesn't mean you replace expert clinicians, but you complement it with, people with lived experience who are working alongside clinicians to help people recover, and it really helps with that sort of the loneliness aspect of it, actually. So there's a whole range of solutions if we could only get a public consensus and the money to actually implement them.
The first question did ask for all the panel's view on how institutions can become places of belonging.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that one. In the world of work that I'm from, it's incredibly important to care for the wellness of your workers if you're wanting them to give of themselves to our clients. So it's something that, as a manager in the aged care world, has been really important to me. And organisations like the Brotherhood invest in significantly. I've got 2 chaplains sitting over here. I know that for them it's very important to provide support to our workforce.
Yeah, I think clarity about purpose, being able to achieve things within the purpose of an organisation that is relationally intelligent towards people who are part of it and who work for it, I think are all in quite strong ingredients to having a good culture where people care about each other and want to see each other flourish.
There's the 2 people with their hands here in the middle can compete over who gets the microphone, and there's one up the very back.
Hi, thanks. I'd just like to offer a question and an example that spans generations and personalities. And I think for those of us who might catch the train to work or the tram, the bus can relate. Nothing for me epitomises the irony between having a sense of belonging and connectedness as ingredients for mental health. And when you see this on the train, everyone seems miserable and we've got noise-cancelling headphones on, we're all on our phones, but does anyone on the panel see potential in this kind of space to use it for those who might be willing to do it as a place to improve or connect or offer some kind of solution? Thanks.
And the question down here.
Much of our society these days, in society, people are looking for reward, and their reward is dollar-based. And in that respect, I lament the lack of volunteers within our community. Much of the work that the church does, much of the work that community does, relies upon a vast team of volunteers, but those volunteers are falling by the wayside. It's not normal for young families these days to seriously consider being a volunteer for something. And those who are volunteering are getting older and less able to do the work that's required for nothing except to have a good fuzzy feeling inside that you're helping somebody else and you're not being paid for it.
Thank you. So is there a way of using these spaces where people naturally gather to actually foster belonging and connectedness, and the role of volunteerism in actually helping shape culture and the changing culture of volunteerism over the last few decades?
I think volunteering has been in my mind a lot while I've been considering this topic. 6 months or so ago, decided to volunteer with another not-for-profit organisation and was so thrilled with the opportunity to engage with quite different people to those that I'd normally get to interact with. And I was quite impressed to see that whilst probably 2/3 of the volunteers that I work with there are retired people, there were also young people and much younger people than myself, and I was quite gratified by that. And it strikes me that it's very much a two-way street, and it could be part of the solution to this problem, that people who volunteer and they do get incredible reward and a sense of connectedness and belonging, and I certainly do. I volunteer with Fair Share in Abbotsford, and I think that is one possible solution to some of this. To the lady's question up the back, I came in on the train today myself, and every time I catch public transport, I'm quite excited by it. I'm a bit of a people watcher and I like the graffiti on the train lines, and so I'm never really on a device, but everybody else in the train seems to be. And I was thinking this morning, I was remembering back to the Life Be In It campaign that we're probably all old enough to remember that. I don't know when it was 70s? And I was remembering the Life Be In It campaign, and I wondered if we actually need a Put Your Device Down campaign, and we'd all enjoy our public transport travels a bit more.
Well, I think there's opportunity of making a lot of spaces richer spaces. And it's good we put attention to that, because we've got people who are creative, who are designers, who understand the kind of things that would interest people that would actually mean, could you make a train carriage, a bus, a tram, a rich environment where you really felt the desire to interact and connect. I'm sure that's possible, but I don't think that's, so maybe we need creative people. You might be one of them who can help make that environment rich, because I think if it was the case, it would really catch on. People would think this is a much better way of spending a half an hour or an hour than just in something which doesn't feel very rich, and even on, despite the best efforts, the textures, the smell, the surfaces of a lot of our even public transport, they're not very aesthetically pleasing. They're very they're very sterile. So it's no surprise people want to enrich the space with some personal devices.
We have time for one more question. Of course, there's a lot of hands. I'll let those with the microphone choose someone.
Thank you.
Emma, you want to choose somebody for the final question for today?
I'd just like to highlight a point that Patrick McGorry made regarding the importance of early intervention with mental illness, that it can change the course of things. I have an 8-year-old granddaughter who just the other day said to me, "Granny, you'll never guess what we learnt at school today." She said, "We learnt about the word boast." I said, "Gosh, darling, that's interesting. I thought for an 8-year-old to have that sort of thing in school was wonderful." Well, I'm just wondering about the possibility of raising the question of loneliness for children at school at an early age. And what age do you think this subject could be introduced into the education department? Because I believe that communication with our young people is vital. I feel that I've seen depression and despair and hopelessness with a member of my family, and I think that perhaps we ignored some of these things earlier on, and perhaps with a combination of home life and parents being more observant and the education system supporting family as well, we may have a little more chance of trying to combat what we are now facing with regard to loneliness.
Thank you. Very briefly, what would an early intervention program look like for you?
I guess it has to be at every level, and I'm glad you brought up schools, because the state government they are actually investing in sort of health/mental health in schools, especially secondary schools. And coming back to what John was saying before, I think it's fair to say that the young people, if they are trying to individuate from their parents, their parents in adolescence are less accessible to them in a way to confide in, and if they need comforting, or if they need someone to confide in, then they're obviously becoming less likely to do that with a parent, and yet the peer group is highly unstable and unreliable, isn't it, in adolescence, and it might be hostile and bullying as well. So where do those young people actually go? A teacher might be one place. If the teacher was I guess we can all remember teachers that we would have been able to confide in, maybe one out of hundreds. But if not, then there should be places in schools where you can actually go. You can actually train the peers in the schools to actually take on these roles. You can train some of the more senior students in listening skills and supportive, responses, And that's been done in schools in Sydney that I've seen. So definitely schools, I would say universities as well. I work for a university, but I've seen universities go bad, I suppose. Their business model has changed. They've been forced into a profit-driven thinking or commercial type thinking, and the pastoral care of the students probably never was that great, but it's certainly got worse, I think, and primary schools as well. If you think back to primary school kids, like I think you mentioned an 8-year-old granddaughter. I remember when I was that age. I mean, if you weren't happy, I was a very shy child, and if you were, very anxious or stressed, who do you talk to? Who do you share that with? Probably your parents, if your parents are in primary school. But if there was some problem with your parents, or if you were, if your family didn't have time, they were working 3 jobs or something, or if you're in out of home care and the state's your parent, So I think what you brought up is really important for the earliest type of intervention. And then once the teachers identify kids all the time who are struggling, and they've got nowhere to send them. They have headspace up to a point now, but then if it's more complex, there's and I work at Origin, we turn away 3 out of 4 teenagers and young people every single day from our triage system in the western suburbs because we have not got the resources to respond, and increasing numbers of those young people are dying. So every level of the system needs to be supported to make early intervention possible.
Can I ask one informational observation? What's the time frame for the Royal Commission, and are you satisfied that its remit is broad enough to embrace the things you're talking about?
I think I'm a big fan of the Premier in having made this step. People said, why do we need it? We know what to do. But he knew that the system is so debased that it needs a public consensus and not just more money. It needs they spend about nearly $1.5 billion on mental health care in Victoria each year, but that only covers 1% of the population. 3% have serious mental illness, so it needs to be $4.5 billion that needs to be spent. So that's a huge amount of money, but you don't want it in just more of the same. You want it totally redesigned. The only way to get that is with the Royal Commission. There will be an interim report by the end of the year. I'm not a commissioner, I just chair the advisory committee for it. But I know the commissioners are absolutely clear there has to be a major reform here. It's a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The final report, I think, will be probably towards the end of next year. But I think it's the best chance we've had for, genuine reform in mental health for decades, many decades.
Well, our thanks to everyone who's made today's conversation possible. Thank you for being here. Thanks to our panellists. The next Archbishop's conversation will be here on Wednesday, the 9th of October. Please put the date in your diaries. And I now hand over to the Archbishop to add his thanks and close our time together in prayer.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you for a really engaging conversation. Certainly a lot of people, I think, have got strong views and feelings and questions about this area. So thanks for your participation, and thanks for 150 people coming here in midwinter. It wasn't such an adverse day, but it's a great thing we can keep our conversation on these important issues going. I feel motivated by the vision that Jesus says of, who he says in John's Gospel, I came to bring life in all its fullness. And I think that until we have people living a full life that is rich, we should properly be dissatisfied that there's something about our humanity which is a great gift that is being debased and unrealised. So if you want to join me in a prayer, I'll just pray briefly for those things we've spoken about. God of love, we thank you that you are a God of community who calls us into a life of human flourishing. We thank you for the things we've opened up today. We thank you for the work of the Royal Commission that will, hopefully in this state, establish new standards, new aspirations, and integration of things to make a benefit to many people. So we pray for us each as we continue our reflections on these matters, that if there is action we can take, you'll give us the energy for that action. And we thank you for the wisdom that we've shared, and we give all these thanks in Jesus' name. Amen. So thank you very much, and please congratulate our speakers.